Hi guys, this is Lauren with Lauren Watkins Art, and today I'm going to show you how I got a softly blended background only using pastel pencils. Here is the reference photo I'm going to be working from. This is just a picture I pulled from Pixabay. I'm not going to be copying it exactly, I'm just going to be using it as a guide and a reference as I create my picture. For this piece, I am working on 400 grit Uart Sanded paper. And this paper is in a sketchbook. You cannot buy a sanded paper sketchbook that I have seen, so I resort to making my own. So I made this sketchbook myself. But I find sanded paper to be the most forgiving paper to work on with soft pastels. I love it, but I love other paper for other reasons, and there's pros and cons to each kind of paper you want to work on. So if you want to learn more about soft pastel paper, you can click this link. Other supplies I'm using for this painting are Bruynzeel pastel pencils, rubbing alcohol, a Taklon paintbrush, a soft tool sponge, and a rubber shaper. I started off by just sketching in the general shape and placement of where I wanted the flowers to be. I believe these flowers are called bachelor buttons, also known as cornflowers. And I like to mark and kind of get the general placement of where objects are going to be before I start working on a really softly blended background like this, because I don't want to do the whole background, have it all perfect, and then sketch over the top of it and then find that I don't like where I place something and then have to cover up the sketching I did and mess up that beautiful background. So I find just kind of mapping in where I want the general placement and kind of what I want the composition to be before I start going in and working on the background just makes the workflow a lot easier and makes for a less frustrating experience. Once I liked the general placement, I went in and I blocked in the first layer of color. I used yellows and greens, even some dark blues and turquoise colors, and I just haphazardly blocked in those colors where I wanted them to be. And then I went in with my rubbing alcohol and a flat paintbrush, and I am just blending that out. Because the rubbing alcohol blends the pastels out so well, I don't have to be as precise and careful when I'm going in with these initial layers of soft pastels. Also, soft pastels are a lot more forgiving of a medium than colored pencils when it comes to blending and how you have to layer. If you've ever tried to create a softly blended background using colored pencils, you know it's a labor of love, where you work with a super sharp pencil and you have to work in really light layers, and you have to make sure all of your pencil strokes are in like these soft circles. And you do that for almost eternity to create your softly blended background. I might be exaggerating on how long it takes, but not by much. Pastel pencils, on the other hand, don't have as many binders, and it's almost pure pigment. So that allows you to lay the pigment down, and then you can blend it. You can use blending tools like rubbing alcohol or a soft tool that you'll see in a little bit, and that will allow you to create these really soft blends. So you can see I did my first layer of pastel pencil, blended that out with rubbing alcohol, let it dry completely, and then I went in with a second layer of pastel pencils. This is going to allow me to deepen the color, kind of refine the placement of where those colors are going to be, the values of them, etc. And then I'm going in with the rubbing alcohol again and blending that out. I love this rubbing alcohol technique because 1, it gives you a little bit of a painterly effect. 2, you don't have to use other supplies like inks or watercolors to do an underpainting with your piece, and you don't fill in the tooth of your paper nearly as much. And you want to protect the tooth of your paper because that determines how many layers of pastel you can add. So one of the things that makes pastel pencils a little bit trickier than your traditional pastels is that there's more binder in them, and you don't have like the wide side of your pastel to like block in big areas. So it can be a little bit trickier to get soft blends. So the rubbing alcohol technique is the first step that I usually do. And then the second step is to use some kind of blending tool. So we did our base layer with the rubbing alcohol. We did that twice to block in those colors, and then we let that dry, and now we're going in for the third time, and this time we're going to be blending it out using a soft tool. A soft tool is an artist sponge that is designed initially for pan pastels, but we use them for all different kinds of pastel blending, but they're just a really dense sponge that comes in all different shapes and sizes. The one I'm using today is a smaller one, and it slides over the end of like a miniature palette knife. But they're a great pastel tool, and I really recommend getting a few. But if you don't have any, you can use like a makeup sponge. Just because I wasn't being as cautious when I was applying the initial layers of pastels to my paper doesn't mean that it gets to continue forever. So now that I'm blending out with my soft tool blender, I am being a lot more cautious with how I'm blending out these pastels. So I am working in little circles, and I am just working back and forth, trying to get really soft blends. Once I got it all blended out, now I'm going in and refining a few areas, going in with my yellows, light greens, tweaking and adjusting the colors and the values as I go along. And once I have this all blended out, I start going in and blocking in the flowers. I do go back and work on the background later on, not a ton, but just a little bit. I find that I tend to bounce around and nothing is final until I put the picture away, because value is relative, and sometimes I have a hard time knowing what values to make the background of something before I add the other objects to the piece. And so going in and adding these flowers and blocking them in and getting some of those other values down, then I could say, oh, this area of the background needs to be a little bit darker so that the highlight on this flower can stand out, and adjust accordingly. Some artists I know, they can just know off the bat, and maybe someday I'll get there, but not yet. So I started the process of blocking in the flowers. I don't know why, maybe it's just a me thing, an artist thing, but it was really satisfying having this really soft blurry background and then drawing in these really crisp lines from the flowers so that they really were in focus. It just was really satisfying to me. This red handled tool that I'm using is called a rubber shaper or a clay shaper. It's a tool that is commonly used in pottery or clay artwork, and it has like a silicone end on it, and they come in different shapes. I tend to really like this one that's more like coned shape at the end. And what I like about it is instead of lifting pigment off the paper when it's blending, it's pressing the pigment into the paper. It gives you a different blend effect, and it allows you to keep crisp lines while also blending the colors together. So it's one of my go-to tools, especially for something like this where I want those details of the flowers to stay in focus a little bit more. Now, this next tip I have is almost the complete opposite of what I did at the beginning. I am encouraging you to pay attention to the direction things are in your picture and making sure your pencil strokes mimic that. So as I'm blocking in the shapes of these flowers and I'm drawing the petals, I'm paying attention to the direction the petals are growing. Some of the petals are pointing upward, some of them are pointing downward, some of them are out to the side. And when I am going in with my colored pencils, I am mimicking that. I'm also looking at the general shapes of the color. It can be overwhelming when you're painting something like a flower where there's a ton of petals, or something like this bachelor button flower where it looks like there's a whole bunch of little flowers connected together. So looking at the general shapes and blocking that in with your colors kind of streamlines the process and makes it less overwhelming. So I'm seeing, oh, look, this shadow looks almost like a star shape. So I'm going to draw that in. That is focused more towards the bottom. So I'm going to do a few more of them there. And then once I get those colors blocked in, then I go in with my blending tools and I still pay attention to the direction I'm blending it in. I did all of this work to get kind of these star pattern shapes that mimic the petals and how they're growing in this flower. And if I went in and just blended it out going left to right, I would lose all that detail and it would no longer look like the flower. So when I blend, I am following the same direction that those petals are growing in. And with a flower like this, especially on a small scale, how these are smaller flowers, I'm just blending in little tiny areas at a time. So let's talk about color for a minute. I mentioned earlier that I'm using the Bruynzeel pastel pencils from Royal Talens. Hopefully that's pronounced correctly. It's a Dutch word, and I'm trying to do better with my pronunciations, but I have now practiced pronouncing that word so many times that it no longer sounds like a real word. Anyways, back to the subject. I was doing this painting in preparation for a review of these pencils, and so I was using a limited palette. I didn't want to bring in any colors from another set. I wanted to see what I could create just using the pastels that came in this set of 40. Because of that, my colors in my painting aren't going to exactly match the colors in my reference photo. And that's okay. You just get creative and you adjust your color palette accordingly. So my colors aren't going to match exactly. There are some ways to get around that. One of them is by blending. Because I am blending my pastels together, I am creating new colors. So if I have a mid-tone that I'm trying to achieve, I can lay a color that's a little bit darker underneath it and then put a color that's a little bit lighter and blend them together, and then I'll get a mid-tone color. That is one of the beauties of working with pastels, is they blend together nicely. So even though they're a dry medium, they're not like paint where you can mix it on a palette before you apply it. You can still create nice blends and create new colors. When you're working with a limited palette, I find that I need to focus on value first and then move to color, because you can paint anything, whatever color you want, and make it realistic, but you need to have your values correct. So I pay attention to the value, how light or dark it needs to be, and then I go to the color. So if I am looking for a shadow color, I pick out my darkest pastels and then I say, okay, I have these pastels to work from. Well, what color do I need it to be? Well, on this flower, it would tend to be a dark blue. Well, I have a dark red, a dark green, a dark purple, and a black to choose from. Well, the black's a little too dark. So what other colors would I choose? Red doesn't really fit. Dark green will make it blend into the background, so I don't want that. So a dark purple. And I use that for the shadow areas, and then I use my blues next to it or on top of it. If I need it to be a little bit darker, I might layer in a little bit of black as well. When I'm trying to pick the best color out of the values I have to work with, I personally tend to lean towards analogous colors. So colors that are next to what I need on the color wheel. Those are my first choice, and then I go out from there, just because I'm going to be layering other colors with it or blending it next to it. And so if I use something that's like an opposite color, sometimes it can make it a little bit muddy and gray. If I need a dark blue, I tend to go with a dark purple or a dark green color to deepen it up. If I went with an opposite color, like a really dark orange color, if I ended up blending that at all together with the blues that were next to it, it might turn brown and a little bit muddy. So I generally stay away from that when I am just trying to color substitute. So now let's jump off that tangent train and get back to what's going on in the picture. First, you will see this beautiful golden afternoon light vanish because it was casting too many shadows on my work table and I had to close my blinds. And now I am going in and refining the leaves and the stems that I had added. I felt like it was a fun twist to not have the leaves and the stems as refined and like perfect compared to what was going on with the flowers and the perfectly blended background. I felt like by having it a little bit more unrefined, it gave it that wildflower feel, and it gave that feeling of movement to the piece and kept it a little bit more interesting. Something that I was deciding at this point was how I was going to make my piece have a little bit more pizzazz. The reference photo has these like blurry pink and white pops of color of flowers that are out of focus. And I didn't do that in my painting, but I felt like it needed a little bit more of something. So what I decided to do was to play into that feeling of movement by having one of the bachelor buttons coming off the side of the page where you only see half of it. So I added another one, and then I decided I wanted to play a little bit more with color in this piece. So the opposite of green is red, and when you use opposite colors next to each other, they make each other seem more vibrant. With my background being mostly green, by adding pink colors to the flowers, it's going to make them pop a little bit more. So I added a few more pink buds, and I kept them pretty small so they look like they're in the background a little bit more. But then I added a little bit more pink to the flowers themselves. And by doing that, it just creates a little bit more interest. It keeps the flowers from feeling kind of boring, and it just adds a little bit more pizzazz to the piece. Once I blocked in the pink in the buds and at the base of the flowers, I wanted to apply it to the blooms themselves. And I also wanted to take this as a chance to refine my values. So making sure my white highlights were bright enough, adding darker shadows where it needed to be darkened up, and then adding little touches of pink to the flowers themselves. And this is just your reminder that it's okay to go back and tweak and adjust things, even if it doesn't match up with your reference photo exactly. I see it all the time with my students where they will draw a specific thing in their picture and think, oh, I'm done with that section of the painting or the drawing. I don't need to go back to it. It's done. And they treat it more like a checklist where once you finish a section, you don't have to go back to it. And that's not how our paintings work. Colors relative, values relative to what is next to it. And so when you fill in an area and then you go and move to a section next to it, all of a sudden the values in that first area might need to be darkened or lightened, or the colors might need to be subtly adjusted, or you might need to add more detail to make it balance out with the rest of your painting. And so don't get in this like checklist, I need to finish this piece in a time frame mode. Focus more on what you want the end results to be, and then going from there. Now, this is your friendly reminder to pay attention to how hard or lightly you are pressing with your pastels. Your pastels are a very soft material, and if you press really hard, it will fill in the tooth of your paper and make it so you can't put any more layers down. And when you are in this refining stage and you are almost done with a piece, it can be very frustrating when you're like, oh, I just need to add a little bright highlight right here or a little touch of color there, and you go to do it and your paper will no longer accept any more layers of pastel because you filled in the tooth of the paper. So make sure you're not pressing too hard too quickly so that you can do lots of layers with your piece and make it reach its fullest potential. There were a couple things I did towards the end of this painting that I feel like really helped pull it together. One was I took breaks from it, and then I would look at it from a distance, and I would even squint at it. My husband calls it my angry artist face, but by taking a step away from something, you can read if the values are strong enough, and squinting at it will accentuate that even more. There are so many times where I will look at a picture up close and think, oh, that's perfect, and then I take a step away from it and it reads kind of flat, and that's because the contrast in values aren't strong enough. The other thing I did was anything that I wanted to really pop out and be more in focus, I went in and made sure that the lines that I did the final details with that were really sharp. I didn't blend them. I made sure I had a really sharp pastel pencil I was using, so I had really nice, refined, sharp lines, and that helped those flowers pop out against the blurry background and read as being more in focus. The last thing I did was I added a few little splashes of color. I really added some purple, even in the stems, and that magenta color, and that helped pull those colors that are in the flowers into other areas of the painting and help it feel a little bit more harmonious, and it just added a little bit more pizzazz. I'm running out of adjectives. But that was when I felt like the painting was done. I signed it. Sometimes I'll do a two-tone signing where I'll sign it with a lighter color and then go next to it with a darker one to help it stand out. But here is the finished piece. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and you found tips in helping you blend your pastel pencils out. And if you have any questions, leave them down below. And if you want to see more of what I create, please hit the follow button. I'll see you next time. Bye.